The Nogazaka 46 musical wasn't something I planned on ever watching initially, but when it was streamed officially to the US a few years ago, I wanted to try and support it in hopes they do more with the musicals internationally, which seems to have paid off if the Super Live is anything to go by. But I actually ended up really enjoying it more than I thought I would. It's an interesting adaptation of the first arc. Some notable changes are the combining of Makoto's introduction and the Masquerade chapter into one event, which actually works pretty well. Rei's introduction has Usagi stand up for her against the crowd accusing her of being the reason kids are going missing, rather than just watching from a distance like in the manga. It works really well in setting up Usagi as someone who genuinely comes to mean something to Rei, and is a change I was surprised to see is rooted in Crystal of all things. Also, the Inners actually give up their lives to bring back Usagi rather than just their powers, which, considering the same setup was reused in La Reconquista, the first of the modern musicals that was also an adaptation of the first arc, and all of the modern musicals in general are overseen by Takeuchi, I can't help but wonder if some point that was supposed to be what happened in the manga, since we know she originally wanted to kill them all off, and them losing their powers was really superfluous at best and resolved anticlimactically. I do feel like this works better in the musical than it would have in the manga, though. The smaller runtime and condensed nature, as well as a bit of increased focus on how Usagi affects the girls and how their friendships form, makes it more effective. Also, unlike the 90s anime, we get to see Usagi's reaction when everyone is revived, since their memories don't get wiped, they just get brought back, which is such a sweet scene. One of my favorites in the franchise. It's so good.
生きてるみんなセーラームーンどうしても会えないかと思ったよかった帰ろうみんなで私たちの家へいつもの場所に
Also, this was the first time Luna had appeared in any of the musicals since the very first. Portrayed with a cute puppet, which works infinitely better than having a person in a cat suit like they did for Luna and Artemis in that first musical. It's also Naru and Umino's first appearances in the musicals ever. And one of my favorite scenes in the show is actually one focusing on them. During the final battle, while the world's going to hell, they have a little conversation where Naru says she knows the Senshi will save them all. Which, if you run with what's implied in the Dark Moon arc, where Naru probably knows Usagi is Sailor Moon, it's extremely sweet. I liked it. Another one of my favorite things in it is the ending, where the girls, and Mamoru, are going through a normal day heading to school after all the chaos they've dealt with, before they're interrupted by Chibiusa crashing down from the sky as Usagi says,
それはまた別のお話
which I think this whole bit combines to make my favorite ending to any version of the Dark Kingdom arc. The sweet reunion scene, the news half of the anchor happily saying the Sailor Senshi have saved the day, calling back to the opening number, and like I said, just seeing the characters get to have a nice normal morning after everything they've gone through is really sweet. Chibiusa crashing the party is a great gag to end on that ties it up perfectly. It feels very much in the style of the 90s anime and musicals' humor, which I adore. The musical also handles the songs somewhat differently compared to the other Sailor Moon musicals, in that there are two sort of overarching songs throughout the show, rather than more dedicated individual songs. There's the Make-Up song, which each of the girls get a version of when they first transform, and Unmei no Atae, which has shorter versions performed throughout the show, and then both get full versions after the end of the show. The final performances are even hyped up in the encore by Naru and Umino acting like announcers at a concert, which is cute. I may be wrong, but I heard this was changed in the recent run though, which kinda sucks. Like I said, I like the musical more than I thought I would. I'm happy I watched it, but I still think it's something that never really had any reason to exist. As I mentioned, the musicals have done adaptations of the first arc before. In fact, it was the very first musical in its revision that did this. But in the past, they've always gone to the effort to avoid covering the origin story aspect. The first musical and its revision were released all the way back during the R days, and were basically pseudo-sequels to the Dark Kingdom arc, having the Shinto and Barrow get revived before the girls are put through basically a retelling of the original arc. But because of the setup, it conveniently skirts around the need to get the team established. La Reconquista just starts with the team already having gotten together. The new Super Live shows Usagi becoming Sailor Moon, but then just exposition dumps Ami, Rei, and Mako joining in a time skip. There's a very good reason for this. These aren't huge Broadway musicals or anything. They're shows performed for a couple weeks at most. The only people that are ever going to see these are existing fans. Anyone who'd want to go see a Sailor Moon musical already knows the story of how the group got together. It's something that doesn't need to be established. As I mentioned, for decades they kept this in mind. Back during the Bandai Miyu days, the first musical and its revisions were the only adaptations of the first arc they ever did. And they did it when said arc was the only completed story to adapt. I talked about this before in a previous video, but the musicals were basically fan service, and they really clearly didn't want to have to exclude the fan favorite Outer Senshi and Shibuya, I'd say, who might not count under the fan favorite aspect, but these were aimed at kids back then. Even their later adaptation of the Black Moon arc worked the Outer Senshi in, because why force yourself to write out popular characters? Now more than ever, Sailor Moon basically exists to sell merch to nostalgic adults. If the kids back then could be trusted to know the origin story of the Senshi already, the adults now definitely can. The new musicals initially went through each arc, somehow in the process going from absolute shit with La Reconquista to my favorite version of the Stars arc with Limb Movement Final. So of course, right after that, they immediately needed to go back and do the first arc again with even less differences. The whole idea of this musical just feels creatively bankrupt. It's something they'd never done before, I guess, but that's by virtue of the fact it was something that seemingly was so unnecessary they didn't even try. After the 2018 and 2019 performances of this, we actually did get a new musical that was an adaptation of the Snow Princess Kaguya story, which, I mean, I haven't watched it yet because I've read the manga story and hated it, but hey, at least it was a new story to the musicals. I still might check it out at some point if I hear good things. But then afterwards, they actually did a completely new story. Well, sorta. It was mainly a musical concert type performance of old songs, but during it there was a short story where Snow Princess Kaguya comes back disguised as an ice cream vendor and brainwashes Luna into fighting the Senshi, which, it's so dumb, but it's amazing. I love it. It was also the first completely new Sailor Moon story that's not an adaptation in any way that we'd gotten since I Know Sanctuary in 2002, which was also half just a concert, ironically. I was really hoping it was testing the waters for another musical with a completely original story. And then they just did this show again with new cast members. Even the Super Live, the first big Sailor Moon musical performed in the West, is just a pretty beat-by-beat retelling of the Dark Kingdom arc. Minako gets a scene in Sailor V at the start, which is the first time Sailor V has been in the musicals. That's cool. And Ami and Rei end up there for Usagi's first fight against a monster, which is something, I guess. It annoys me because it felt like we were so close to getting something new again, but instead, it's back to the Dark Kingdom arc. Like I said, I enjoyed the version of the musical I watched. I really did. But it really does feel like something that didn't have any real reason to exist beyond money. This wasn't a story that needed to be told in this medium. The musicals had avoided doing it prior to now because they were meant for an audience they knew didn't need to see this again. Hell, the aforementioned Super Live jumps from Usagi's first fight to just after Makoto has joined the group for exactly this reason. And that's the first musical the West has gotten. It seems like they just can't or don't want to or aren't allowed to do anything new with Sailor Moon anymore, so might as well just keep rehashing the same story to sell more overpriced merch, I guess. At least it was a fun rehash. This video's been really depressing.